All right. Good afternoon and welcome to the ARC at Schools webinar, Supporting Spanish-Speaking Families as They Learn About Special Education. My name is Katie Schmid. I'm the director of the ARC at School at the ARC of the United States. Our guest speaker today is Patricia Albino, Director of Projects and Outreach at the ARC of California. In addition to dedicating her profession to supporting people with IDD and their families, Patricia's experience as a mother of a child with a disability allows her to understand firsthand the challenges and needs of the community with which she works. We are thrilled to have Patricia with us today. I'll now turn it over to Patricia.
Thank you so much, Katie. And good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Let me see. Okay. So today we'll be talking about supporting Spanish-speaking families as they learn about special education. And then we'll talk about tips on engaging the Spanish-speaking families. So I like to start with a little introduction about myself. Like Katie said, my name is Patricia Albino. I am the Director of Projects and Outreach at the ARC of California. I am the parent of a teenager with autism. He was diagnosed when he was 2 years, 8 months old, and he is the reason why I got into this type of work. For the last 5 years, I have worked at my local family resource center as a family resource support specialist, running support groups, providing trainings and one-on-one help to families who have children with a disability, both in English and Spanish. Also, for the last 5 years, I have been the coordinator for Congreso Familiar. And Congreso Familiar is a conference for Spanish-speaking families who have family members with a disability and is held twice a year in Northern California. This year, like many others, we had to pivot to an online conference where we provided 34 weeks of virtual programming, which included trainings on topics such as IEPs, SSI, IHSS, and we will be providing more virtual trainings soon. I included the website on here if you'd like to get more information or refer some of your families there. We also have several trainings that were recorded and can be found on the Congreso Familiar's YouTube channel. Today, we're going to be looking at some of the barriers that Spanish-speaking families face when addressing their children's special education needs. And then we'll discuss tips that we can utilize to support them. So before I get started, I'd like us to think for a minute and, raise your hand if you want, or just, think in your head, how many of us here today have children? So, kind of keep that in your head. How many of you have kids? And as you guys are thinking about that, now, let's think about how many of you guys have experienced any of these. So this is just a short list of things that we do experience, but some of the ones that stick out for me are sleepless nights, tantrums, trouble finding a babysitter, potty training, setting up routines, and on and on. We can go on for days. But this is basically what we sign up when we choose to become parents. And the demand of parenting often takes a toll on us. I like the picture that I put on here where the mom just looks really tired, but the kids are in the background because they keep going. So I'd like to kind of keep this in mind, and we'll come back to this later. So one of the barriers I'd like to start with today is language. Many parents either lack of have limited English proficiency, and this can produce tremendous fear, embarrassment, frustration, and intimidation for Spanish-speaking parents. This also leaves them feeling disempowered to participate in any decision-making affecting their children's education. When we do IEP trainings, we talk about parents being an important and equal member of their child's IEP team. And on the IEP document itself, it asks if the school facilitated parent involvement. So I'd like us to keep in mind that if I don't speak the language, I do not have the opportunity to participate, and I'm not an equal member of the IEP team. In addition to that, there are language variations, and some people may not be aware of this. I like to remind folks that even though I speak Spanish, when I interact with someone from another country, another Spanish speaking country, I may not necessarily understand them. And this just adds another layer of challenges. Interpreters. We know that interpreters are necessary when working with a monolingual Spanish speaking family, and it is a much needed service, but we do have to keep in mind that not all the interpreters are experienced. They may not all understand the disability culture, and the language variations can make it challenging. So having bilingual staff is always a better option. As we know, language barriers become daunting to our community, but we need to find ways we can be more inclusive. And despite any language barriers, it behooves us to reach out to those of different languages and cultures so that they feel welcome and comfortable. The next barrier is learning the special education language, which is yet another layer that families need to learn and overcome. Families are met with having to learn about what an IEP is. They need to understand that an IEP is a process, it is a meeting, and it is the document itself. They need to learn about FAPE. What is it? What is least restrictive environment and how does it apply to my child? What is a 504 plan? What is OT? What is PT? Early intervention. So families are learning how to navigate this new and complicated system, and they need to learn how it applies to their situation. It is a lot of information that they receive, and it is an overwhelming process for parents. And even if you speak English, the process is not easy. So another barrier is parent-teacher perceptions. We know that Hispanic children are the second largest growing population of students in schools in the United States. Meanwhile, teachers in charge of their education are predominantly white, middle class. So this cultural mismatch creates conflicts that arise out of cultural misunderstandings. Oftentimes, parents feel ignored, disrespected, judged, and discriminated against. And I have seen this firsthand at back to school nights, for example, where parents who actually make an effort to attend don't even have the courage to approach the teacher. And teachers don't have an interpreter that night. And oftentimes they rely on the student to translate for the parent. So I like to share an example of something a teacher said about a special education parent. The teacher said, "It is hard to get much information from the parent. I think it must be a cultural thing with his parent." Now, this parent happens to be me. And I'm not sure if the teacher accidentally CC'd me on the email or she intended for me to see it. And as you might imagine, this does not sit well with me. I was not sure what culture she was referring to because I do speak the language. I am well versed on the special education system. I was raised and educated in the US, and this comment left me with a lot of questions and different feelings. Now, I don't have the barriers that we've mentioned earlier, but because I do look different, this teacher created a different perception about me that was not accurate. The next barrier is the level of education. So data from the 2010 census confirmed that only 66.7% of Hispanics aged 25 and older had a high school diploma, compared to 93.3% for non-Hispanic whites. We also know that there are high rates of illiteracy among Hispanic parents. So this leads to parents feeling limited in their ability to contribute in positive ways to the children's education. And these feelings are heightened as children move up in grades because the curriculum becomes more difficult and the subjects are sometimes subjects that parents may not have studied themselves. And to this, we add learning about special education services. Parents do report feeling frustrated and helpless. And there is an overwhelming feeling of intimidation and embarrassment when having to address educators, but particularly administrators. So imagine what it must be like for them during those IEP meetings. where they're in a room full of professionals. And even for me, when I started, I used to get a lot of anxiety going into IEP meetings with a room full of professionals. The next one is limited knowledge of how systems work. Hispanic parents in the US regard education as very important. They have high education aspirations and expectations, and they genuinely want their children to succeed. However, the school system here is different than the one from which they came. Hispanic parents struggle to navigate aspects of a system they are unfamiliar with, and that sometimes fail to speak their language. They may feel they do not have much to offer during an IEP meeting. They are unfamiliar with the different parent roles and expectations of the American school system. Parental involvement looks different for Hispanic parents than it does for non-Hispanic white parents. They are unaware that being parents of special education students guarantees them certain rights, such as the right to have an interpreter and the right to have material sent home translated in their language, that places them in a better situation to better advocate for their children. Parents often feel a sense of helplessness about their ability to contribute to their children's education. They simply do not know how they can contribute in positive ways, and these factors can create a great deal of stress and anxiety for parents, as well as confusion and frustration, and they deal with an educational system that is different from theirs. The next one is social economic. So economic hardships hinder their involvement in their children's education. They are more concerned where their children's next meal is coming from, and they worry how they will clothe their children. And what if this family is a single parent family? A lot of the time, they barely have enough to meet the needs of their children. Low-income parents often work long hours and multiple jobs and have to weigh the benefits and implications of taking time off work to participate in school events or even their IEPs. Unfortunately, becoming involved in school often takes a back seat to losing a day's pay, possibly even their job, and consequently not being able to meet the financial demands of the household. Childcare and transportation are also other factors that put stress on parents. And we need to be mindful of this when scheduling meetings with the parents, and more importantly, when we schedule their IEP meetings. The family structure. So the structure and form of what has in the past constituted the traditional family, comprised of the biological parents and their children, has changed and evolved over the years in the US. And the reality today is that this structure is no longer the norm. For single mothers living with their children, the effect of poverty is more pronounced. And these concerns are magnified in single parent homes where the lack of support and resources are even more limited. Families often lack natural supports as well because they're separated. They might not have extended family in the area. And if they do have family in the area, oftentimes they're still not considered a support. A lot of times the extended family does not accept a diagnosis of the child or do not understand how to be helpful and end up not being supportive. This causes a lot of isolation for these parents, children's special needs. So another thing that families deal with is the diagnosis that their children receive. As you can imagine, it can be devastating when a parent gets the news that something is not right. It is not easy for a parent to quickly accept and be okay with being told that your son or daughter has a lifelong condition. A lot of you might be familiar with the loss cycle and understand that it's not a straightforward path to deal with the emotions associated with a loss, or in this case, a diagnosis. And we might think that because a parent has an older child who is now in middle school or in high school, that they have accepted the diagnosis and that they do not experience these feelings anymore. But I am here to tell you that that is far from the truth. So earlier, I mentioned that my son was diagnosed when he was 2 years and 8 months old. And I've accepted his diagnosis, but I'm experiencing these feelings again, and he is now 17. As he gets ready to leave high school, I am realizing that the hopes and dreams I had for him are lost. Lately, I have been receiving emails from the school about workshops on how to write college essays, invitations to college orientations, and how to apply for colleges or financial aid workshops. And I had come to grips many years ago about the fact that his journey would not be what I had envisioned for him. But nonetheless, here I am in this lost cycle again. So it just takes, just a little something to kind of bring us back and experience these feelings of grief again. So a couple other implications, limited advocacy skills. And families do have a high level of respect and they will not question authority. They trust and often do not question educators' decisions regarding their children's academics or services. We are brought up with traditions of respect for anyone in a position of authority, whether it be a teacher, a doctor, or religious leader. And we would never think to question them. And parents trust that whatever recommendations are given by the IEP team must be in the best interest of their children. And we don't challenge it. Oftentimes, parents don't know what type of questions to ask. Parents feel it is their job to educate their children at home by teaching good values and making sure that they are well taken care of. And they will trust what the school personnel tells them. And here are some common IEP mistakes that we have heard often. Having the IEP meeting without the parent. Now, this is discrediting to the parent's ability to be an important and equal member of the child's IEP team. Parents' schedules need to be respected because they work, they have double duties at home, they may not have a babysitter, et cetera, et cetera. So let's be respectful and find a time that works for everyone. I have heard schools say that they have had to have IEP meetings without the parent because it was more convenient for the school staff. And also because sometimes getting substitute teachers to cover for the special education teacher to come to the IEP meeting would cost too much, or that there were not enough substitute teachers. But this is not acceptable. If a parent is supposed to be an important and equal member of the child's IEP team, they need to be there. Not providing an interpreter is also not acceptable and becomes a waste of time for the parent who went through so much to plan for this IEP meeting. And parents also do not know that they have a right to reschedule. And even when they do know and they have this information, most of the time parents will not reschedule because they will feel bad about putting everybody else out. Forcing families to sign the IEP document the day of the meeting. If families knew that they don't have to sign it that day, they would choose to take it home and review it with someone before signing it. It also doesn't make sense to force them to sign the document if they have not been provided with a copy of the documents they are signing in language. And this brings us to the last point. Not providing these documents in a timely manner is also not acceptable. I have heard parents who have shared that it has taken some districts up to 6 months to get them a copy of their IEP in their language, and that should not be happening. So let's not make assumptions. So avoid stereotypes at all costs. Parents who don't follow through, they're often seen as they don't care and are often made to feel guilty about what they do or don't do. I like to remind everyone that it takes a Spanish-speaking parent more effort to get anything done. For example, they have to find a friend or a neighbor or their son or daughter to help make phone calls if the school or the organization doesn't have bilingual staff. They rely on others to help understand what just happened at their latest IEP meeting. Let's not assume that they know the rights. A lot of times, staff has said the parent was okay with not having an interpreter, or um, oftentimes parents don't know that they can have an interpreter, and that's why they didn't say anything. Or other things we've heard, the interpreters are too expensive, or the parent didn't ask for the documents in their language. But most of the time, the reason why they don't ask for these is because they don't know that they have a right to any of this. This idea that families do not care about their children's needs or services is also not accurate. They do care. They just don't know how to be helpful or how to advocate for what their children need. Uninvolved and disinterested parents. Again, this is not true, but instead, let's try to identify the barriers that make it difficult for them to be involved. On, on my son's IEP, one of his accommodations is to check for understanding. And I think we need to make sure that parents have a full understanding of what happens at the IEP meetings. Many times I've met with parents and I ask them basic questions of what happened at the meeting to try to help them in order to plan their next steps, and they can't tell me. And so at that point, my first question for them is, did you have an interpreter? And sometimes even with an interpreter, they can't tell me what happened. And it can be heartbreaking when this happens, especially when they have signed the IEP, saying that they were in agreement with everything. So I think we need to do a better job at making sure that parents are really understanding what is happening with their children's special education services. I once met a parent who had a fourth grader who had had an IEP since he was younger, but it wasn't until the fourth grade that his mom finally understood what it meant to have an IEP. And at some point, she, when I was working with her, she mentioned to me, I just thought it was extra help he was getting. So I used to just sign it. And that's just, again, heartbreaking. Now, let's go back to this question that we asked earlier. How many of you have children and how many of you have experienced this? If anyone has children, we have experienced what can be the exhausting role of parenthood at times. Parenthood comes with a lot of responsibilities and a lot of challenges. Now, with everything that we've discussed up till now, let's take what we know that can be an exhausting process when raising a child, and let's just add another layer, okay? Ready? So let's add the education, the special education layer. And at this point, we need to prepare and attend for IEP meetings. We need to address the speech therapy. We need to make sure they have OT. We need to set up transportation. We need to track progress of their IEP goals, schedule ABA, secure ILS and SLS services, find specialized doctors and dentists, help with the homework, manage medications, prepare for and attend IPP meetings, and track down your service coordinator at the regional center for us that live here in California, understand what agency provides what, et cetera, et cetera. So as you guys can see, it is a lot. It is too much. It is a lot for parents to deal with, and we need to be cognizant of how much is on their plate. Now let's talk about some ways we can be helpful to families. Districts should be culturally sensitive and knowledgeable about the challenges of Spanish-speaking families. So attending trainings is a good way to get that information. And listen and learn, ask questions, read, and take the time to learn about their language or their heritage. Be flexible. We know that school staff and administrators are also overwhelmed and have set work hours. But I think we need to consider what the parents are going through and find ways to compromise. Use less terminology and jargon and stick to family-friendly vocabulary. Avoid acronyms, or if you're going to use them, explain what they are. Inform parents of what services are out there. They may not all be appropriate for their own children, but at least they know that these services and supports are out there. Parents have a hard time expressing and asking the type of services and support their child needs in order to thrive. A lot of times the blame is put on the parent because they're not asking for a support or a service. If they don't ask for something and 2 years later the parent finally asks, then provide the service then. And let's not make the parent feel guilty for not knowing this information 2 years ago. Ask questions without being condescending. I think that's with anybody we work with. Offer to help and brainstorm. It is easier for someone on the outside to have clarity and see things from a different perspective. The parent is living in the moment and is overwhelmed with so much. They may not be able to look past the current situation and come up with solutions or ideas. Be patient. Parents can't retain all the information. Repetition can be helpful. The special education system is overwhelming and it's not easy to overwhelm. I don't know how many IEPs under my belt, and I'm still learning about the system. And I still find it frustrating. Create a warm and safe and inviting environment where parents can feel welcome. I think that even if they don't speak the language, this will go a long ways if they know that someone cares and will help them. Remind parents of their rights. We would be doing the parents a disservice if we fail to inform them that they have rights. Encourage parental feedback. They will not willingly volunteer feedback, but encourage them to participate little by little. The more they do it, the better they get. It just takes practice. Always have resources in their language, whether it's a brochure, a flyer, an online resource, just anything that can be given to them in their language. Become familiar with family resource centers or advocacy agencies in your area and refer families frequently. So family resource centers are there to provide this information and education that parents need to be informed about their rights in relation to the children's education. They will learn that they have a right to an interpreter. They have the right to have material sent home in their language. And I think by doing this, we're not only creating a culture of respect for the parents and the children, but we're also empowering parents to become better advocates for their children. Knowledge is key, and when parents are informed, educated, and understand their rights, they become empowered and vested in their children's education. And when I say refer families frequently, it's because sometimes parents are not ready to utilize those resources, especially as they're starting out. But we do have a duty to keep reminding them of where to go for additional supports. Provide guidance and mentorships from other parents, connect parents with others who may be dealing with similar situations. It's the best way to learn, connecting with others. And it makes it easier to learn within a community where we are not only dealing with similar challenges, but where we can share resources as well. Support group participation is very helpful. This is where parents learn from their peers. It's where I've learned the most. I like to tell people that I've learned more from other parents than I ever learned from professionals. Share trainings and information that comes across your desk. I realize that we can be bombarded with information on trainings or conferences that are happening, and oftentimes it's just easy to dismiss and delete the emails. But do know that parents are hungry for information as long as it's in their language, and it must be shared. So let's make an effort to share as many resources with parents as possible. And also recognize that it is a lot of work for these programs and agencies and resource centers to invest in this programming and these supports that they put together for the community. And it's a shame when families are not able to take advantage of the wonderful resources that are there for them. So that is pretty much it for me for today. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Katie.
Thank you so much, Patricia. So everybody, I'm going to have you hold all of your questions for just a moment because I do want to share some new resources from the ARC at School before we open it up for questions. Next slide, please. There we go. So this fall, we have launched a new section on our website. I have the website listed right there at the top of the slide, thearcatschool.org. And I will also send a link out to everybody who registered for this webinar, so you'll get to go directly to this new section on our site. But we created 5 new resources, all in Spanish, and I have them listed right there. We have a general overview of special education. We have a parent's rights, early intervention, IEP, and then also Section 504. And these resources are all completely free. Our intention is for professionals that work with families to get a hold of these resources and get them into families' hands. So that really was the intention behind getting the audience that we have here today, is that we know that you guys are the ones connecting with families. So we would love for you to take all these resources and then send them off to whoever you think will benefit from them. We definitely plan to add to that page. Right now, it's just a starting point. Again, we have those 5 resources, but we're really hopeful in the future that we can continue to add resources that have been translated into Spanish and continue to build more resources for families and professionals who work with families. One other thing I would like to mention is that we do have a special education advocacy curriculum. Some of you may be familiar with it, some of you may not be familiar with it, but basically it covers special ed law, and it really covers a lot of topics that relate to special education advocacy. And our hope is that we can eventually get that translated to Spanish. So I just want to mention that to this audience, that that is on our radar. It has been on our radar. And we really are hopeful that soon we will be able to find the resources to be able to get that fully translated so that families can benefit from that curriculum as well. Next slide. So now that I've shared those resources, and I will email a link to all those resources out to you all, I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions. Please be patient with me as I sort of sift through what's being sent into the chat box. And as I look at these questions, I'll pose those out to Patricia, and we'll go from there. So just give me just a second to review questions, and feel free to put them on into the chat box. Okay, so first question I see that's an easy one, and it's for me, is that do the Spanish language resources have English documents that are the same so that we know the information that is contained in them? Yes, we do have English copy, so I can send both out. Again, a link I can send you to the site where all the Spanish copy is, but then I can also send an English copy, so I will make note of that. All right. I see a question about reaching if there's an email address to send Spanish-speaking families that is cleared by the ARC at School. I would just say send them to our general email address, which is school@thearc.org. And again, I can include that in the email that I send as a follow-up. Even though I'm not a Spanish speaker, we do have Spanish speakers in the office, and we can certainly direct any families to the right folks to get them the information that they need. We also also actively work with translators as much as possible. So we certainly would do our best to work with the families and give them the information that they need. So again, give me a second as I review these questions. Question about sharing the resources on their on your own websites. Yes, you can link to these resources. You don't need our permission. We would be glad to have you share these resources on your website. I'm not sure if you know the answer to this, Patricia, but I will ask you. What is the most reliable translation software for English to Spanish documents? Do you have any suggestions around that?
I actually do not. I know that a lot of families or a lot of people actually use Google Translate. Oh, sorry. They use Google Translate, and it has gotten better over the years. And sometimes I use it myself, but it's not 100% accurate. When I get to translation from Google Translate, I still have to go through it, and sometimes things are not worded correctly. So as far as I know, that's the only thing that most people are using.
Great. A couple more questions I see. One is that will you receive a recording and can you share it out with your coworkers? Yes, feel free. I will be emailing a link to the recording of this webinar, and feel free to share that with whoever you think can benefit from the content. Got a great question right here for you, Patricia. Can you comment on whether parents should get evaluations translated into Spanish? Examples include like a psych evaluation or educational evaluation. And this participant said, I've never seen this done. I've never seen this done once as a part of a reevaluation. So it sounds like they maybe have seen it done. I'm not clear on that, but do you have a response to that question?
I would say absolutely. I think, again, if parents are supposed to be an equal member of the IEP team, and the speech therapist or the occupational therapist is reviewing their evaluations, it must be in their language so that families, can take it home, review it, have questions written down before they get to that IEP meeting. So this just helps to prepare them for that meeting.
Next question is, what is the best way to develop trust with the Spanish speaking community organizations to provide services?
That is an excellent question, because I know in the Latino community, trust is huge, right? And I think it just has to be done little by little. For me, as I worked at a family resource center, it helped that I am a parent myself. It helped that I can relate to what they're going through. And that's a form of starting to create that trust. It was also helpful that I can speak their language and I understand what they're coming from. I understand their cultural background as well, so I don't make judgments as to why they did or didn't do certain things. So it does take a lot of work. I think that even when we work with families that speak our same language, that are also parents, we still have to be gentle and always be there for families in order to build that trust little by little.
Great, thank you. Another question is, how does ESOL play into special ed inclusion for a child who is Spanish speaking in your experience?
I'm sorry, I don't know what ESOL is.
So it is Spanish language, like an additional service for students whose primary language is Spanish.
Oh, I get it. Okay, so can you repeat the question, please?
Sure, sure. How does ESOL play into special ed inclusion for a child who is Spanish speaking?
Yeah, so I think that's another barrier that I didn't bring up, because now the child is, they might be receiving these English services, English supports, right? In addition to receiving maybe speech therapy or occupational therapy. So it can be a lot more work for families to manage all these services. And another thing that we want to keep in mind is, the student themselves, um, it's also challenging for them, right? Because a lot of the times they're often getting pulled out of their classroom to provide these additional supports on the side, like whether it's the speech or the PT or the OT, or the English services. So it can be hard, but I know that there's many families out there that, have to juggle all these services.
Great, thank you. So the next question is that in this particular instance, there's a parent that has some basic questions about their child, and they've been reaching out to the teacher, and the teacher is encouraging the parent to email questions over to start, but the parent wants to have a translator and is not comfortable with email. What would you say should be expected of the teacher? And what would you suggest that the parent maybe does to handle this?
So in this case, the parent, of course, has every right to have an interpreter there. And if the parent doesn't feel comfortable emailing, I mean, that's another barrier. I mean, more barriers keep coming up. A lot of Latino parents do not have access to email. They don't even have an email address. So if the only mode of communication for this teacher is email, then I think the school district, the administrators, the teacher, itself has to come up with different ways to be supportive to this parent.
Do you have any thoughts on using a certified translator um, and an interpreter versus utilizing your organization's bilingual employees as translators or interpreters?
I think in my experience, if the organization has bilingual staff, that's always better because they're actually doing the work day to day. They're working with the families day in and day out. And so they would have a better understanding of the type of work that they're doing. Interpreters, once in a while you find an excellent interpreter. I mean, I have an ongoing list myself of interpreters that are excellent. And whenever you do find an excellent, interpreter, just take their number down and, use them for further reference. But um, so I think interpreters can be useful, if they're really competent, and they really understand the special education system.
Okay, I have another great question. Do you have any tips on how to engage teachers in this? And this particular participant has said that they've struggled with teachers who are resistant. And while, they know that there's law behind it, ensuring translators and interpreters, any ideas on how to actually reach these teachers to help them understand why this is so important?
I think having trainings. So I think it would be helpful for teachers to actually put themselves in the parents' shoes and understand what it's like to be a parent of a special education student. Um, I think even when I meet other, people in my life, it's hard for them to relate. When I meet parents who have special education children, we can relate right away because we're living it. And so I think we need to do a better job at educating, whether it's our neighbors, our friends, or our teachers on how to better relate to parents that are dealing with so much.
On the flip side, I did have a question around actually engaging with families. And this particular participant mentioned that they had set up a training and they had posted in a lot of different areas that they thought were reaching families, but they ended up not having any families attend this training that they had organized. Do you have any sort of creative ways or ways that you've reached out to families to engage them and get them to attend a training that's providing them this important information?
That is a great question because I know that is on the flip side, and we have experienced that where the organizations go out of the way to bring this great programming to the community and then they don't show up. And that can be very frustrating because we know that families need the information and we have the information to provide, but somehow there's a disconnect in between. I think for us, when we do our presentations in Spanish, it's really about having that trust with the families and doing word of mouth. We'll call them and we'll utilize folks from our support groups to say, hey, there's a training coming up, and we know that this is an important topic to you. So spread the word. We'll use all means of communicating with them. We'll do email for those that have email. We'll do text. We'll do WhatsApp. We'll do Facebook. So really any way of reaching out to them, but I think it really does come down to this, issue of trust.
Thank you so much. I'm loving seeing all of the chatter in the chat box. We have so many different professionals from across the country here today, and I just want to thank you guys all for taking the time to attend. We do have a little bit more time for questions if there are any that anybody else wants to pop some into the chat box. But again, I just want to thank you all, and please feel free to share out those resources that I'm going to be sending you, and this recording if you are inclined to share this. All of it is up to you to share out to your community. But I'll keep an eye on the chat box just for another couple more minutes, see if anybody has any other questions, and then we can wrap up. Okay, so there's a question here. Can you address what you would maybe suggest doing if parents are not able to read or write in Spanish and are reluctant to admit that?
Yeah, I think that is a big challenge because obviously, if the parent, doesn't know how to read or write, it can be quite embarrassing, right? And they don't want to put themselves out there like that. Um, and we have stories to share about where service providers kept saying, this parent is just not getting involved. They're not doing anything. They don't respond to me. Come to find out that they didn't know how to read or write. So how can they, be in touch with you? So I think in these situations, it can be hard. Um, but I think providing that, I mean, you're just going to have to go the extra mile to support these parents. Walking them, it's, hand holding them, providing the information that they need. I think, meeting other parents, like I said, it's important because they might find another parent in the support group that might be able to share information with them or kind of guide them through the process. I know that a lot of times folks do rely on their family members to do this for them. And that's great. But what happens when the daughter's at school and can't help with this? So maybe creating connections with other parents that would be supportive, I think would be helpful.
Another question is, do you have any tips for working with families that are cautious and hesitant to access community resources due to documentation status?
Yeah, that is another challenge that we do see. I think it's important to remind families that some of these services will not impact your status, or sometimes they're going through the process of trying to get status established. And so again, just providing that information, that knowledge, what services do impact, what services do not. A lot of the times families don't understand that the service is for the child. And if the child was born in the US, then, the child deserves those services and those supports. And so helping the families make that distinction that, if the service is for the student, it doesn't affect your immigration status. But I think it's just providing information and education around that.
Wonderful. If you want to go ahead and move to the final slide for me, Patricia, I think we can go ahead and start wrapping up. Again, I want to thank you all for taking the time to attend today. And most importantly, I want to thank you, Patricia, for sharing all of your experience and knowledge with us. And I will be following up through email, so keep an eye out for that. And I really hope that you find the resources that we'll be sharing useful, and feel free to shoot us some feedback at school@thearc.org, this email address right here. And again, we are doing our best to try to continue to build upon these resources, and are hopeful that in the future we'll be able to continue to add to our list of resources that are in Spanish. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.